The air in Mobile, in the year of our Lord 1858, was thick enough to drink. It was a cocktail of salt from the bay, the cloying perfume of sweet olive and magnolia blossoms, and the ever-present dusty odor of cotton. For 16-year-old Samuel Vance and his 12-year-old sister Clara, it was the only air they had ever known. Their world was one of manicured gardens, cool verandas, and the gentle rhythm of a life cushioned by the immense wealth their father, William Vance, had amassed as a shipping merchant. Their home on Government Street was a testament to his success, a proud brick federal with towering columns and windows that gazed out at the bustling city. From the upstairs balcony, Samuel could watch the great steamships on the bay, their smokestacks painting dark smudges against the cerulean sky. He could hear the city's symphony, the clatter of horse-drawn carriages on cobblestones, the distant clang of a blacksmith's hammer, and the melodic calls of street vendors selling oysters and sweet potatoes. It was a world of order and privilege, a gilded cage whose bars were invisible to those who lived within it. Their father, William, was a man of quiet strength and a surprisingly gentle heart. He did not possess the boisterous, backslapping demeanor of many of his contemporaries. He preferred the company of a leather-bound book to that of a crowded saloon, and his conversations with his children were often filled with tales of history and far-off lands gleaned from the ship captains he employed. He possessed a moral compass that seemed, to Samuel at least, to point to a truer north than most men in Mobile. He owned no people, a fact that set him apart and was a source of quiet tension between him and his younger brother Elias. A man cannot build a future in Alabama on the sweat of his own brow alone, Elias had once sneered during a tense Sunday dinner. It is unnatural. Elias was all sharp angles and restless energy, his eyes constantly calculating, his smile a thin, predatory curve. He owned a sprawling cotton plantation upriver called Vance Dominion, a place spoken of in whispers as a land of brutal efficiency and little mercy. "Then I shall build an unnatural future," William had replied calmly, placing a reassuring hand on Samuel's shoulder. One built on wages, not whips. Their mother, Isabel, was the heart of their home. She was a woman of breathtaking beauty and grace, with skin the color of warm honey and eyes that held the wisdom of an old soul. She had come from New Orleans, a city of myth and mystery, and she had brought with her a love for music, exotic spices, and stories told in a softly accented French. It was this heritage that Elias seemed to despise most of all. He referred to her in private as the Creole, the word dripping with a venom that Samuel could feel but not fully comprehend. The first shadow fell upon their idyllic world, not with a thunderclap, but with a cough, a small, persistent cough that rattled in William's chest. The doctors came and went, their faces grim, their satchels filled with useless tinctures and powders. They spoke of miasmas and bad humors, their ignorance a shroud that slowly suffocated the family's hope. William grew thin, his quiet strength replaced by a fragile weariness. He would sit on the veranda, wrapped in a blanket even in the sweltering afternoon heat, his gaze fixed on the bay, as if waiting for a ship that would never arrive. One evening, as a fever raged through him, he called Samuel to his bedside. The room smelled of camphor and sickness. William's hand, once so strong, was a bony claw clutching his son's. "Promise me, Samuel," he rasped, his voice a dry whisper. "Promise me you will always protect Clara and your mother. Your uncle, Elias. He does not understand our family. He sees assets, not affections. Be wary of him. Your mother's papers, her freedom papers and our marriage certificate. They are in the lockbox, in my study, behind the false bottom of the humidor. Remember?" Samuel, his throat tight with a fear he had never known, could only nod, the word promise, a silent vow in his heart. Days later, William Vance was gone. The Mobile sky wept a torrential rain on the day of his funeral, turning the red clay of the cemetery to a thick, clinging mud. As the final spade of earth was thrown upon the coffin, Samuel looked up and saw his uncle, Elias, standing beneath a black umbrella. Elias was not looking at the grave. He was looking at the house on Government Street, his eyes filled with a chilling, proprietary gleam. The serpent had been invited into the garden, and the air, once sweet with olive blossoms, now carried the unmistakable scent of sorrow and decay. In the immediate aftermath of William's death, Elias was a master of feigned grief. He moved into the guest suite of the government street house, his presence a constant suffocating pall. He was a creature of shadows and whispers, gliding through the halls with a funereal solemnity that felt practiced and hollow. He spoke in hushed, comforting tones to Isabel, his words of condolence dripping with a sympathy that never quite reached his cold, calculating eyes. "My dearest sister," he would say, taking her hand, "you and the children shall want for nothing. I will handle all of William's affairs. You must not trouble your beautiful head with such dreary matters as ledgers and debts." He portrayed himself as the family's savior, the sturdy oak against which they could lean in their time of storm. To the outside world, to the bankers, the lawyers, and the other merchants of Mobile, Elias Vance was the dutiful brother, stepping in to manage his late sibling's complex estate and protect his bereaved family. But within the walls of the house, a subtle poison began to seep into the foundations of their lives. Servants who had been with the family for years, who had watched Samuel and Clara grow, were dismissed for minor, imagined infractions. A cook was let go for supposedly wasting sugar, a stable hand for a perceived lack of deference. They were replaced by staff of Elias's own choosing, silent, watchful individuals who seemed more like spies than servants. They reported every conversation, every tearful moment, back to their new master. The children felt the change most acutely. Their lessons were suspended. The laughter that once echoed through the grand house was silenced. Elias would often observe them from a distance, a slight, unnerving smile playing on his lips, as if he were appraising livestock. He would run a hand through Clara's dark, lustrous hair and remark, "Such exotic beauty, just like her mother." The comment was meant to sound like a compliment, but it felt like a brand. Samuel, remembering his father's warning, grew increasingly suspicious. He tried to speak to his mother, to voice the unease that coiled in his gut. "Mother, Uncle Elias, he's going through Father's desk," Samuel said one afternoon, finding her arranging flowers in the parlor. "He's locked the study. He says he's organizing papers, but I don't trust him." Isabel, lost in a fog of grief, waved a dismissive hand. "Samuel, please. Your uncle is a man of business. It is what he does. He is helping us. Your father trusted him enough to name him executor." "Father warned me about him," Samuel insisted, his voice low. "Your father was ill, my love." She sighed, her eyes welling with tears. "He was not in his right mind. Elias is family. We must trust in family now." But Elias's actions went beyond mere organization. He began selling off assets from William's shipping company with a swiftness that suggested not prudence but plunder. Ships were sold, contracts were terminated, and debts were called in. When Samuel questioned him, Elias's mask of kindness would slip, revealing the cold steel beneath. "These are complex matters for a boy," Elias said, his voice hard. "Your father, bless his gentle soul, was a poor businessman. He left a mountain of debt. I am merely trying to salvage what I can for you and your sister." It was a lie, and Samuel knew it. His father had been meticulous, his company the most prosperous in Mobile. The true objective of Elias's machinations became clear one rainy Tuesday. Samuel watched from his window as two men, a city clerk and a portly, sweating lawyer he didn't recognize, arrived at the house. They were ushered into the now forbidden study by Elias. For hours, the low murmur of their voices was the only sound in the oppressive silence. Later that evening, after the men had left, Samuel found a discarded piece of paper that had fallen from the lawyer's portfolio near the entryway. It was a draft of a legal petition. His reading was still that of a boy, but he could decipher enough of the curling script to make his blood run cold. It was a petition to the probate court, filled with legal jargon he didn't understand. But two words stood out, repeated over and over again: provenance and chattel. He saw his mother's name, Isabel de la Rosa Vance, and next to it a notation in Elias's spidery handwriting: "Inquire with Orleans Parish regarding St. Louis Cathedral baptismal records. Lineage questionable." He ran to his father's humidor, his heart hammering against his ribs. He felt for the false bottom his father had described. It was there, but when he pried it open, the space was empty. The lockbox, containing his mother's freedom papers and the proof of his parents' lawful marriage, was gone. That night, the house on Government Street no longer felt like a home. It felt like a trap. The serpent was not just in the garden. He had coiled himself around the very heart of their family, and Samuel realized with a sickening certainty that he was slowly, methodically beginning to squeeze. The social circles of Mobile's elite were a fertile ground for rumor, and Elias Vance was a masterful sower of discord. He began his campaign not with a direct assault, but with a series of carefully placed whispers, delivered over glasses of bourbon in men's clubs and through feigned sorrowful confessions to the city's most influential matrons. His target was Isabel. His weapon was her past. "It breaks my heart," he'd say to a fellow cotton broker at the Factors Exchange, his voice a study in counterfeit anguish. "My dear brother, William, he was always led by his heart, not his head. That woman, she enchanted him." "A Creole, isn't she?" the broker would ask, intrigued. Elias would sigh, a heavy, theatrical sound, "From a very obscure New Orleans family." William believed her to be a free woman of color, of course, with papers to prove it. "But I have been investigating. For the sake of the children, you understand. To protect their inheritance." He would leave the sentence hanging, allowing the listener's own prejudices to fill in the blanks. The term Creole in the Deep South was a loaded one. While it could refer to those of pure European descent born in the colonies, it was more often used as a euphemism for a complex, mixed-race heritage that the rigid black and white society of Alabama found both alluring and deeply threatening. Elias exploited this ambiguity with surgical precision. He focused his efforts on the concept of plaçage, the historical system in New Orleans where wealthy white men entered into civil unions with free women of color. He painted Isabel not as William's loving wife, but as a cunning placé who had tricked his noble brother into a marriage that was, in the eyes of Alabama law, illegitimate. Her mother, her grandmother, the line is murky. He'd confide to the wife of a prominent judge over tea. "I fear the papers William possessed were forgeries. A common trick in that city of sin. I am simply trying to unravel the truth, to protect the Vance name." These whispers, like spores on the humid air, found purchase and grew. Suddenly, the Vance family was viewed with a new suspicious lens. Isabel, once admired for her exotic grace, was now seen as an interloper. The children, Samuel and Clara, once the darlings of their social set, were looked upon with a mixture of pity and morbid curiosity. Invitations to parties dried up. Afternoon visits ceased. The invisible walls of their gilded cage were slowly becoming solid stone. The legal front of Elias's attack was just as insidious. He had hired a lawyer named Silas Croft, a man whose professional ethics were as flexible as his considerable girth. Together, they worked to dismantle William and Isabel's life. Elias, having stolen the authentic documents from the lockbox, now produced his own set of evidence. He presented a forged bill of sale, yellowed and brittle with artificial age, which he claimed to have discovered amongst his brother's papers. It purported to show that Isabel's grandmother had been purchased by a New Orleans gentleman decades ago and had never been legally manumitted. He followed this with a carefully altered baptismal record, obtained through bribery from a corrupt clerk in Orleans Parish. The document now listed Isabel's mother with the designation quadroon slave. In the eyes of Alabama's draconian legal system, this was all that was needed. The law of partus sequitur ventrum was absolute. The status of a child followed that of the mother. If Elias could prove Isabel was, by blood, enslaved, then she and her children were not heirs to William's fortune. They were the fortune. Samuel and Clara felt the change in their uncle's demeanor. The pretense of kindness was gone, replaced by a cold, imperious authority. He was no longer their guardian. He was their keeper. One afternoon, Clara was reading in the garden when Elias approached her. He looked down at her, his shadow falling over the page. "You have your mother's eyes," he said, his voice devoid of warmth. "And her complexion. It is a shame. A terrible, terrible shame." He walked away without another word, leaving Clara shivering despite the oppressive heat. Samuel, desperate, tried to find an ally. He sought out his father's old lawyer, a venerable man named Mr. Abernathy. But the old lawyer, intimidated by Elias's growing influence and perhaps swayed by the rumors, refused to see him. Samuel was turned away at the door by a clerk who looked at him as if he were a piece of dirt on a polished floor. The city, which had once been their playground, was now a hostile territory. The whispers had grown into a chorus of condemnation, fueled by greed and deep-seated prejudice. The legal framework, designed to protect the institution of slavery, was a weapon pointed directly at their hearts. Elias was not just rewriting their present, he was erasing their past, meticulously crafting a fiction that would allow him to commit an unimaginable evil in the full, righteous light of day. The lies were taking root, and Samuel knew, with a terrifying certainty, that a bitter harvest was coming. The day the world ended, it began with an unnatural quiet. The usual morning sounds of Government Street, the clatter of the milk wagon, the cry of the fishmonger, seemed distant and muffled, as if coming from behind a thick pane of glass. Samuel and Clara were confined to their rooms, watched over by one of Elias's silent, grim-faced servants. Isabel had been summoned by their uncle to the parlor an hour earlier, and the suffocating silence that followed was more terrifying than any shouting match could have been. Suddenly the parlor doors burst open. Isabel stumbled out, her face a mask of disbelief and horror. Elias followed her, his expression one of cold triumph. With him were two other men, the portly lawyer, Silas Croft, and a burly, stone-faced man Samuel had never seen before, who wore the badge of a city sheriff. "This is an outrage, an abomination," Isabel cried, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and fury. "You cannot do this, Elias. These are your brother's children." "I am doing what the law demands," Elias said, his voice ringing with false piety. "I am restoring order. The court has ruled. You have no standing here, woman. You have no rights. You are property." He held up a sheaf of papers, the official seal of the Mobile County Probate Court gleaming in the morning light. The sheriff stepped forward. "Isabel de la Rosa, by order of the court, you are remanded to the custody of your legal owner, Mr. Elias Vance, as are your issue, the boy Samuel and the girl Clara." The word issue struck Samuel like a physical blow. It was a word used for livestock, for offspring, for property. He looked at Clara, who had her hands pressed against her mouth, her eyes wide with terror. "No!" Isabel shrieked, positioning herself between the men and her children. "You will not take them." The sheriff, with an air of bored impatience, shoved her aside. Isabel fell, her head striking the edge of a mahogany side table with a sickening crack. She lay still on the polished floorboards, a dark pool of blood beginning to form in her lustrous hair. Clara screamed, a raw, piercing sound of pure agony. Samuel, propelled by a blind rage, launched himself at Elias. "You monster, you did this!" He was a boy of 16, strong from sailing and riding, but Elias was a grown man, and Samuel's attack was clumsy with fury. Elias caught him by the front of his shirt, his knuckles digging into Samuel's collarbone. For a moment, Samuel saw the true face of his uncle, stripped of all pretense, a visage of pure, unadulterated hatred and greed. "You were never his son," Elias hissed, his face inches from Samuel's. "You are her whelp, and you will learn your place." He threw Samuel to the floor beside his unconscious mother. The sheriff and Silas Croft grabbed him and Clara, their rough hands bruising their arms. They were dragged from the house, the home where they had been born, where every corner held a memory of love and laughter. They were hauled past the portraits of their ancestors, past their father's empty chair, and out onto the sun-drenched street. A wagon was waiting, not a passenger carriage, but a rough-hewn farm wagon, the kind used for hauling cotton bales or feed. Samuel and Clara were thrown into the back like sacks of grain. As the wagon lurched forward, Samuel twisted around to look back at the house. He saw two of Elias's servants carrying his mother's limp body out the front door. They handled her not with care, but with the detached efficiency of men handling a rug. They were taking her not to a doctor, but towards the back of the property. The realization hit Samuel with the force of a physical impact. They were being separated. He would never see his mother again. He screamed her name, a desperate, hopeless cry that was swallowed by the noise of the city. The people on the street, their neighbors and acquaintances, averted their eyes. Some looked on with a kind of grim satisfaction, others with a flicker of pity, but no one moved to help. No one intervened. The law had spoken. The court had ruled. The betrayal was complete, sanctified by the seal of the state, and carried out in the bright, unforgiving light of a mobile morning. As the wagon turned the corner, leaving Government Street behind, Samuel Vance, son of a wealthy merchant, ceased to exist. In his place was only a boy, stripped of his name, his family, and his future, who had just learned the most brutal lesson of his new world. The law was not a shield for the weak, but a cudgel for the strong. The journey to Vance Dominion was a descent into a living nightmare. The wagon rattled for hours, leaving the familiar cobblestones of Mobile behind for rutted dirt tracks that plunged deeper and deeper into the rural heart of Alabama. The city's scent of salt and commerce gave way to the smell of damp earth, pine, and the oppressive, fecund odor of the swamp. For Samuel and Clara, every jolt of the wagon was a punctuation mark at the end of a chapter of their lives, each mile a nail in the coffin of who they once were. They arrived at dusk. Vance Dominion was not a place of genteel southern charm. It was a factory for producing cotton, and it was built for brutal function, not beauty. A long, unpaved road, lined with skeletal-looking cypress trees draped in Spanish moss, led to the main house. The house itself was a large, imposing structure, but it lacked the grace of their mobile home. It was stark and unadorned, its windows like vacant eyes staring out over the fields. But it was the fields themselves that seized the children's attention. They stretched out in every direction, a vast monotonous sea of green plants dotted with the white puffs of cotton. Even in the fading light they could see figures moving among the rows, men, women, and children, their backs bent, their movements slow and exhausted. This, Samuel realized with a cold dread, was their new reality. The wagon did not stop at the main house. It continued past it, down a path that led to a collection of small, windowless shacks clustered together. This was the slave quarters. The air here was thick with the smell of wood smoke, sweat, and despair. Faces peered out from the doorways, their expressions a mixture of curiosity, suspicion, and a deep, weary resignation. The sheriff hauled them from the wagon and shoved them forward, where a man was waiting. He was a tall, whip-thin white man, with a sun-scorched face and pale, colorless eyes. He held a coiled leather whip in one hand, tapping it rhythmically against his thigh. This was Mr. Shaw, the overseer. "These are the two?" Shaw asked, his voice a low drawl that held no trace of warmth. He looked them over as a butcher would appraise a side of meat. "The master's kin," the sheriff said with a smirk. "Handle them accordingly." Shaw let out a short, harsh laugh. "Kin or not, they're property now. They'll learn the rules of Vance Dominion soon enough." He turned his dead eyes on Samuel and Clara. "You ain't got names no more. You got numbers. You," he said, jabbing a finger at Samuel, "are number 73. And you," he pointed at Clara, "are 74. You'll answer to that and nothing else. You'll work from can't see morning to can't see night. You'll do what I say when I say it. You look at me wrong, you get the whip. You talk back, you get the whip. You stop working, you get the whip. You understand me?" Clara was trembling so violently she couldn't speak. Samuel, his body aching, his heart a cold, heavy stone in his chest, managed a small, defiant nod. Shaw's eyes narrowed. He stepped forward and, with a sudden, vicious movement, backhanded Samuel across the face. The blow sent him stumbling to the ground, the taste of blood filling his mouth. "You nod when I speak to you, boy?" Shaw snarled. "You say, 'Yes, sir, Mr. Shaw.' Now get up and say it." Samuel pushed himself up, his cheek stinging, his mind reeling. He looked at Clara's terrified face, and the fight went out of him, replaced by a desperate need to protect her. "Yes, sir, Mr. Shaw," he mumbled, the words feeling like acid on his tongue. "That's better," Shaw said with satisfaction. He pointed to one of the shacks. "That's your hovel. There's a bucket for water and a slab of wood to sleep on. You get food once a day. Be out in the fields before the sun is up, or I'll come drag you out myself." They were shoved into the small, dark cabin. The door was barred from the outside. The inside was bare earth, with a single wooden plank against the wall. It smelled of mildew and human misery. Clara finally broke, collapsing onto the dirt floor in a storm of silent, shuddering sobs. Samuel knelt beside her, pulling her into an embrace. He had no words of comfort to offer, no promises that everything would be all right. Everything was not all right. Their world had been burned to the ground. He held his sister, the only piece of his old life he had left, and stared into the suffocating darkness of the cabin. The soft, fragrant air of Mobile was a distant memory. Here, in the heart of Vance's dominion, the only air they breathed was filled with the dust of the cotton fields and the stench of absolute despair. The transformation was complete. They were no longer children. They were numbers. They were slaves. The first weeks in the fields were a blur of agony. The soft hands that had once held books and painted watercolors were now raw and bleeding from the sharp burrs of the cotton plants. The relentless Alabama sun beat down on them, blistering their skin and leaving them perpetually lightheaded. Their muscles screamed with a pain so profound it became a constant, dull roar in the background of their existence. Every day was the same. Rise in the pre-dawn darkness, stumble to the fields, and pick cotton under the watchful, merciless eyes of Mr. Shaw and his assistants, until their fingers were numb and their backs felt like they would snap in two. Samuel learned quickly that any sign of his former life, his educated speech, his straight posture, was seen as defiance and was met with Shaw's leather whip. He learned to stoop his shoulders, to keep his eyes on the ground, to mumble his responses. He learned to become invisible, a ghost in the vast, white fields. He urged Clara to do the same, to hide the bright spark of her intelligence behind a mask of docile obedience. Survival, he realized, was a performance. Their only solace was in each other, in the whispered words of encouragement they shared on their wooden plank at night, their bodies aching in unison. But it was a fragile, desperate comfort. A glimmer of something more came in the form of an old man named Moses. He was tall and gaunt, with skin the color of dark walnut, and eyes that seemed to hold the sorrow of generations. He worked the row next to Samuel, his movements slow but economical, his hands gnarled but efficient. He rarely spoke, but he watched the children with a knowing, compassionate gaze. One afternoon, Clara stumbled from heat and exhaustion, collapsing between the cotton rows. Before Shaw could see her, Moses was there. He moved with a surprising quickness, helping her to her feet and splashing a bit of water from his gourd onto her face. "Easy now, little bird," he murmured, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "The sun is a cruel master. You gotta learn his ways. Don't fight him. Move with him." He showed her how to tie her kerchief in a way that better shaded her neck, how to pace her breathing, how to find a rhythm in the grueling, repetitive work that would conserve her strength. That evening, as they ate their meager ration of corn mush and salt pork, Moses sat near them. He didn't pry or ask about their past. The grapevine of the enslaved community was swift, and everyone knew the story of the master's kin who were now among them. Instead, he spoke of survival. "This place, Vance's dominion, it's meant to break you," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "It wants to grind you down until you forget you was ever a person. It wants to turn your soul to dust, just like this here soil." He looked at Samuel, his ancient eyes seeing past the boy's feigned subservience. "I see the fire in you, boy. That's good. Fire keeps you warm. But you let it burn too bright, the overseer will see the smoke and come to put it out. You gotta learn to bank that fire. Keep it low, hot, and hidden. It's the only way to keep it from going out." Over the coming days, Moses became their silent teacher. He taught them things that no book ever could. He taught them how to read the sky for rain, how to find edible roots at the edge of the woods, and how to listen. "You listen to the birds," he'd say, not looking up from his work. "They'll tell you when a stranger's coming down the road long before the dogs do. You listen to the talk in the kitchens. The house servants hear everything. Knowledge is the one thing the master can't whip out of you." He taught them the silent language of the quarters, the meaning of a certain hymn sung at dusk, the significance of a blanket hung in a particular way. He was teaching them how to navigate the treacherous currents of their new world, how to be enslaved without letting the enslavement conquer their spirit. One night, Samuel, his body throbbing with pain from a lashing he'd received for not meeting his daily quota, felt a profound wave of hopelessness wash over him. "What's the point, Moses?" he whispered in the darkness of their cabin, where the old man had come to bring a poultice of herbs for his back. "We'll die here. Nothing will ever change." Moses finished applying the cool paste to the raw welts on Samuel's back before he spoke. His voice was firm, a bedrock of certainty in the shifting sands of their despair. "The sun sets every night, boy, but it rises every morning. Every single morning. The night feels long, I know. It feels like it's gonna last forever, but it don't. You just gotta live long enough to see the dawn." It was not a promise of freedom. It was not a guarantee of escape. It was something smaller and perhaps more vital. It was a glimmer of hope, a lesson in endurance. In a world designed to extinguish all light, Moses was teaching them how to nurture the small, stubborn flame of their own will to survive. For the first time since they had been dragged from their home, Samuel felt something other than fear and rage. He felt the stirrings of resilience. The physical toll of life advanced dominion was immediate and brutal, but the psychological chains clamped down more slowly, their weight growing heavier with each passing day. The transformation from a person into property was a meticulous and cruel process, designed to strip away every vestige of a former self. For Samuel, the greatest burden was the loss of his name. To be called 73, or simply boy, was a constant, grating reminder of his debasement. He would repeat his own name to himself at night, a secret mantra in the dark. Samuel Vance. My name is Samuel Vance. It was an act of defiance, a way to hold on to a piece of himself that Elias could not touch. His defiance, however, often boiled to the surface. He could not completely hide the intelligent, questioning look in his eyes, and Mr. Shaw seemed to take a perverse pleasure in trying to beat it out of him. The overseer saw Samuel's background not as a tragedy, but as an affront. A boy who had known comfort, who could read and speak properly, represented a disruption to the natural order of things as Shaw understood it. "Think you're better than the others, do you, fancy boy?" Shaw would sneer, his whip whistling through the air for the slightest infraction. "Down here in the dirt, you're all the same, less than the dogs in the master's kennels." The lash became a familiar agony. It taught Samuel a bitter lesson. His body was not his own. It belonged to Elias, to be used, abused, and broken at his uncle's whim, with Shaw as the instrument. The pain was searing, but the humiliation was a deeper wound, a cancer that ate at his pride and threatened to consume his spirit. For Clara, the psychological torment took a different form. As a young girl of 12, she was thrust into a world of constant threat. She learned to make herself small and unnoticeable, to move through the plantation like a shadow. The leering gazes of the overseers and even of her own uncle were a constant, unspoken menace that made her skin crawl. She was assigned to the laundry, a steamy, back-breaking job where women worked over massive tubs of boiling water, their hands perpetually scalded and raw from the harsh lye soap. Here, in the company of other women, she learned to navigate the complex social hierarchy of the enslaved community. She discovered that there were divisions even in this lowest stratum of society, between field hands and house servants, between those born on the plantation and newcomers. She learned that trust was a rare and precious commodity, and that a misplaced word could lead to a whipping or worse. It was here, amidst the steam and the endless piles of soiled linen, that she and Samuel learned the fate of their mother. An older woman named Hattie, who had once been a seamstress in the main house, told them the story in hushed, sorrowful tones. "Saw it with my own eyes," Hattie whispered, her back to the door as Clara scrubbed furiously at one of Elias's shirts. "The master, he didn't keep your mama here for more than a day, had her locked in the spring house. Then a trader came, a man with cold eyes and a fancy carriage. Your uncle, he sold her." Samuel, who had come to the laundry on the pretext of fetching clean water, felt the ground shift beneath his feet. "Sold her? Where? Where did she go?" Hattie shook her head, her expression grim. "Heard the trader talking. Said he had a contract for a buyer down in Louisiana, on the sugar plantations. They call that place the slave's grave, child. The work, it kills people faster than the fever." The news was a physical blow, worse than any of Shaw's lashings. Their secret, desperate hope that their mother might somehow come for them, that she might find a way to rescue them, was extinguished. She had been sold south, into the brutal anonymous maw of the sugar trade, a fate from which almost no one returned. That night, in their dark shack, the children did not speak. There were no words for this new, profound depth of despair. The chains that bound them were no longer just the laws of Alabama or the will of their uncle. They were forged of loss and hopelessness. Samuel felt the weight of his promise to his father, "Protect your mother," as a crushing failure. He had failed. Their mother was gone, swallowed by the insatiable beast of the system that had also consumed them. The weight of their new reality settled upon them, heavy and suffocating, threatening to crush the last vestiges of the children they had once been. In the crucible of Vance Dominion, survival was impossible alone. The enslaved community, though fractured by fear and suspicion, had forged its own invisible networks of support and resistance. For Samuel and Clara, learning to navigate this world and build trust was as vital as learning to endure the overseer's whip. Their initial status as the master's kin had made them objects of suspicion. They were an anomaly, a disruption to the grimly predictable order of the plantation. Some viewed them with resentment, seeing them as a reminder of a world of privilege they had never known. Others saw them with a pity tinged with fear, worried that association with them would bring unwanted attention from Shaw or Elias himself. It was Moses who acted as their bridge into this community. His quiet endorsement vouched for them. He would share his extra bit of food with Clara when she looked particularly faint, or subtly guide Samuel to a section of the field where the picking was a little easier. These small acts of kindness were noticed, and they slowly began to erode the walls of mistrust. Their first true ally, aside from Moses, was a young woman named Sarah. She worked alongside Clara in the laundry, a quiet but fiercely observant woman who had been born and raised on the plantation. She had seen families torn apart, children sold away from their mothers, and men broken by the sheer brutality of the system. Sarah had learned that resistance was not always loud and defiant. More often, it was small, secret, and communal. She began to help Clara in subtle ways, showing her how to use a certain root to soothe the lie burns on her hands, sharing stories and information in hushed tones over the steaming washtubs. "You gotta be like the water, little one," Sarah told her one day. "Soft enough to get into any crack, but strong enough to wear away stone. You don't fight the rock head on. You just keep flowing." Samuel, meanwhile, found an unlikely confidant in a man named Jupiter who worked in the stables. Jupiter was a giant of a man, his muscles corded from years of handling horses and heavy wagons, but he had a gentle, quiet demeanor. He was responsible for the care of Elias's prized horses, a position that afforded him a small degree of autonomy and access to the goings-on around the main house. Jupiter recognized in Samuel a sharp mind being wasted in the fields. He saw the boy's keen observation and his barely concealed anger. One evening, as Samuel was mucking out a stall, Jupiter spoke to him, his voice a low rumble. "Heard you can read." Samuel froze, his heart pounding. Literacy among the enslaved was a dangerous, often forbidden skill. "A little," he admitted cautiously. Jupiter nodded. "That's a powerful thing, more powerful than a whip if you know how to use it, but it can get you killed just as quick." Through these tentative connections, Samuel and Clara began to understand the plantation's hidden language. They learned who could be trusted with a whispered secret and who was an informant, trading scraps of information for a slightly larger food ration or an easier job. They heard stories of the world beyond Vance Dominion, hushed tales of escapes, of runaways following the North Star, of a network of safe houses they called the Underground Railroad. But they also heard the stories of those who were caught. The tales were grim, cautionary fables of bloodhounds, brutal punishments, and men made into horrific examples to discourage others. Freedom was a beautiful, tantalizing dream, but the price of failure was unthinkable. This fragile alliance was not one of grand conspiracies or revolutionary plots. It was an alliance of shared suffering and quiet support. It was in the extra piece of cornbread slipped into Clara's hand, the poultice left for Samuel's back by an unseen benefactor, the shared look of understanding between two people as the overseer passed by. It was a community woven together with the invisible threads of shared humanity in a place designed to destroy it. For Samuel and Clara, becoming part of this network was a crucial step. They were no longer just two isolated children fighting to survive. They were part of a larger body, a family forged in bondage that understood the simple, profound truth that the only way to bear the unbearable weight of their chains was to help each other carry the load. One sweltering morning, a summons came that sent a ripple of fear and speculation through the quarters. Clara, now 13, was to be taken from the laundry and assigned to work in the main house. Such a change could mean anything: an easier life away from the lie and the steam, or a far more dangerous and predatory existence under the direct watch of the master. Elias Vance had made the decision himself. In a grotesque display of his power, he enjoyed having his brother's daughter serve him. Her light skin, her refined manners, remnants of her former life that she could not completely erase, appealed to his sense of twisted irony. He saw her as the ultimate symbol of his triumph over William. To have his niece, a Vance by blood, serve his meals and mend his clothes was a daily affirmation of his absolute dominion. Clara entered the house with a heart full of dread. It was a place of ghosts. The furniture was finer, the floors more polished, but it was a cold, sterile environment compared to the warmth of her childhood home. Every room was a museum of her uncle's cruelty, a testament to what he had stolen from them. Her duties were varied and endless. She polished silver, dusted ornate furniture, arranged flowers, and served at the dining table, her movements quiet and precise, her eyes always downcast. She had to learn a new set of rules, a new and more intimate form of subservience. In the fields, the danger was physical and overt. Here it was psychological, a constant, nerve-wracking performance where a single misstep, a spilled glass of water, a word spoken out of turn, could bring swift and severe punishment. She was under the command of the housekeeper, a stern, older enslaved woman named Prudence, who ran the household with an iron fist. Prudence was a survivor who had secured her position through decades of unerring obedience and by anticipating the master's every whim. She saw Clara's arrival as a threat and treated her with a cold, demanding severity. Despite the fear, Clara's new position gave her something she hadn't had in the fields: information. Working in the house, she became invisible, a silent presence who heard and saw everything. She learned the rhythms of her uncle's life, his business dealings, his visitors, his moods. She dusted his study, a room filled with the ghosts of her father's books, and saw the letters and ledgers he left on his desk. She learned that Elias was in financial trouble. The plantation, while productive, was expensive to maintain, and his extravagant lifestyle in Mobile, which he still frequented, was a constant drain on his resources. He was over-leveraged with cotton brokers and was growing desperate. This desperation made him even more cruel and unpredictable. One evening, while serving dinner to Elias and a visiting businessman, Clara stood silently by the sideboard, a ghost in a simple homespun dress. Her uncle, flush with wine, was boasting. "The beauty of this enterprise," Elias said, gesturing vaguely towards the window, beyond which lay the fields and the quarters, "is that the assets appreciate. Not just the land, but the people themselves. A healthy young buck can fetch $1,000. A girl like that one," he flicked a dismissive finger in Clara's direction, "can be worth even more, depending on the market." The businessman chuckled, and Clara felt a cold dread wash over her. She was not just a servant in her uncle's house. She was an asset on his ledger, a commodity whose value he was constantly calculating. The house was not a sanctuary from the fields. It was simply a different kind of auction block. But she also saw his weaknesses. She saw his vanity, his paranoia, his deep-seated insecurity that he masked with blustering cruelty. She learned to read his moods by the way he walked or the tone of his voice. She stored every detail, every overheard conversation, every name mentioned in the sharp, observant mind that he had failed to crush. Her proximity to power was a double-edged sword. It exposed her to a more intimate and insidious form of danger, but it also armed her. In the fields, she had learned to survive. In the master's house, Clara began to learn how to fight, not with her hands, but with her eyes and ears. She was no longer just a victim of her uncle's betrayal. She was a witness. While Clara navigated the treacherous currents of the main house, Samuel was fighting his own battle for his mind in the stables. His work with the horses was physically demanding, but it offered a degree of solitude that was impossible in the communal misery of the fields. The stable was his sanctuary, a place where the clean, earthy smell of hay and leather momentarily masked the stench of despair. It was here that his friendship with Jupiter deepened. Jupiter, who had been on the plantation since he was a boy, had long ago learned that knowledge was the only true form of freedom a man in his position could possess. He was secretly literate, a skill taught to him years ago by a kind-hearted tutor who had briefly worked for Elias's father. Jupiter had nurtured this forbidden knowledge in the shadows, understanding its immense power and its immense risk. He saw the same hunger for knowledge in Samuel. He started by leaving scraps of old newspaper, used for packing goods or cleaning tack, where he knew Samuel would find them. At first, he just watched. He saw the boy's eyes trace the letters, his lips silently forming the words. He saw the flicker of the life he once had, the educated mind straining against the bonds of ignorance his uncle sought to impose. One evening, as they were rubbing down the horses after Elias had returned from a trip, Jupiter finally broke the silence. "The Port of Mobile sees record cotton exports," he said quietly, quoting a headline from a scrap of paper Samuel had been looking at earlier. Samuel's head snapped up, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock and fear. "Don't look so spooked, boy," Jupiter rumbled, not missing a beat in his work. "Words are just words. No need to be scared of them." From that day on, the stables became a secret schoolhouse. In the quiet moments after their work was done, by the dim light of a carefully shielded lantern, Jupiter became Samuel's teacher. He helped Samuel move beyond the simple reading of his youth, teaching him how to truly comprehend the text. He used the discarded newspapers to teach him about the world beyond Vance's dominion, about politics, abolitionist movements in the North, and the growing tensions between the states. "You read this," Jupiter would say, pointing to an article about a debate in Congress, "and you understand that our world ain't the whole world. It's just a rotten little piece of it. There are people out there who think this," he gestured around the stable, "a proxy for the entire plantation, is a sin against God." Knowledge became Samuel's weapon, a tool to hone the edges of his anger into something sharp and focused. Reading about the outside world reaffirmed his own identity. He was not just number 73, a field hand or a stable boy. He was Samuel Vance, and he belonged to that other world, the world of ideas and laws, even if that world had betrayed him. The greatest prize was a tattered copy of the Bible that Jupiter had kept hidden for years. In its pages, Samuel found not just stories, but a language of justice and deliverance that resonated with his own desperate situation. The story of Moses leading his people out of bondage was no longer an ancient tale. It was a living, breathing promise. This education was a dangerous, clandestine act. If they were discovered, the punishment would be severe. A whipping for Samuel was certain, but for Jupiter, who was the teacher, it could mean being sold south, or worse. The risk bonded them together, forging a deep and powerful alliance. Elias and Mr. Shaw had taken Samuel's fine clothes, his name, and his freedom. They had tried to break his spirit with whips and relentless labor. But in the dusty, quiet corners of the stable, with the help of a man who understood the liberating power of the written word, Samuel was secretly reforging the most important part of himself they had tried to take: his mind. He was no longer just enduring, he was preparing. He didn't know for what, but he felt a shift inside him. The banked fire that Moses had spoken of was being carefully stoked, its embers glowing brighter in the darkness, waiting for the right moment to be fanned into a flame. The oppressive heat of the Alabama summer deepened, and with it, Elias Vance's desperation. The whispers Clara overheard in the house grew more urgent. Her uncle was deeply in debt to creditors in New Orleans, and the price of cotton had taken a slight dip, squeezing his finances even further. He became more volatile, his temper flaring at the slightest provocation. One evening, Clara was refilling a decanter on the sideboard in the dining room. Elias was meeting with Mr. Shaw, and their voices carried from the adjacent study. She froze, pretending to polish the crystal, and listened. "The crop is good, but it's not enough," Elias said, his voice laced with frustration. "I need capital, and I need it now. These New Orleans vultures are threatening to call my notes. Unsell some of the hands? Shaw suggested, his tone practical and callous. A prime buck like that Jupiter from the stables would fetch a good price. Or the boy 73. He's young and strong. A cold fear gripped Clara, but she remained perfectly still. No, Elias snapped. Not yet. Selling them off piecemeal looks weak. I have another asset I can leverage. There was a pause. I'm riding to New Orleans in 2 weeks. I have a meeting with a man named Devereaux. He's a specialist. He knows the market for particular tastes. He's interested in a girl, one with a refined background. Clara felt the blood drain from her face. She didn't need to hear her number to know who he was talking about. She was the asset. Her uncle was planning to sell her in New Orleans. Her mind raced, a whirlwind of panic and desperate calculation. New Orleans, the city of her mother's birth, the city that held the key to their past and the proof of their identity. But it was also the city where her uncle planned to finalize her doom. The 2-week timeline was not a reprieve, it was a death sentence. She had to get a message to Samuel. Getting a message from the main house to the stables without being seen was a monumental risk. Communication between house servants and field hands was discouraged and watched with suspicion. A note was impossible. Neither she nor Samuel could risk being caught with writing. It had to be a spoken message, delivered through their fragile, secret network. Her first step was Sarah, her friend in the laundry. The next day, over the steaming tubs, Clara feigned a dizzy spell as Sarah helped her to a stool in the corner. Away from the prying eyes of the other women, Clara whispered frantically, "He's selling me, in 2 weeks, to New Orleans. You have to tell Samuel, he has to know." Sarah's eyes widened, but she simply nodded, pressing a cool, damp cloth to Clara's forehead for show. "Just rest a moment, child. The heat gets to everyone." The message began its perilous journey. Sarah had to wait for the right moment, a fleeting, unobserved exchange. That evening, as the field hands were returning to the quarters, she passed the man who brought wood to the laundry. She traded the message for a piece of gossip, embedding the urgent words in a stream of idle chatter about the cook's temper. The woodcutter, in turn, passed the message to his wife, who worked in the communal garden near the stables. Finally, as dusk settled, the wife went to the stable well to draw water, a common and unremarkable task. As Jupiter passed by, leading a horse to the trough, she spoke, her voice low and even. "The master rides to the city in 2 weeks. The little bird is to be caged and sold. Tell the boy." That night, long after the plantation was cloaked in darkness and silence, Jupiter slipped out of the stables and made his way to the shack where Samuel and Clara's mentor, Moses, now lived alone. He relayed the message. A short while later, a soft, scratching sound, the signal of a cricket, but not quite, came from outside Samuel's cabin. Samuel slipped out, his heart pounding. Moses was waiting in the deep shadows between the shacks. The old man's face was grim in the faint moonlight. "Your sister is in danger," Moses said, his voice a barely audible whisper. "The master means to sell her in New Orleans. You have 2 weeks." The words hit Samuel with the force of a physical blow. The abstract horror of their situation had suddenly become concrete and immediate. This was no longer just about survival, about enduring until some distant, unknown dawn. The clock was ticking. If they did not act, Clara would be lost to him forever, sold downriver into a fate he could not bear to imagine. The time for banking the fire was over. The time had come to find a way to make it burn. The news of Elias's intentions galvanized Samuel. The simmering rage he had suppressed for so long now had a focal point, a deadline. Despair gave way to a cold, desperate clarity. They could not run. 2 children on their own would be hunted down by slave catchers and their dogs within days. A full-scale revolt was a suicidal fantasy. Their only hope, their only conceivable path to salvation, was to expose Elias for the monster he was. They needed proof. His father's last words echoed in his mind. "The lockbox. In my study. Behind the false bottom of the humidor." The humidor was in their old house in Mobile, an impossible distance away. But Samuel reasoned that Elias, a man obsessed with his triumph, would have taken the lockbox. Such a trophy, the very documents that proved his fraud and secured his fortune, would be something he'd want to keep close. If it existed, it had to be somewhere in the main house. The plan began to form in the dead of night, in hushed, urgent conferences between Samuel, Moses, and Jupiter. It was a desperate gamble, a three-pronged strategy that relied on perfect timing and unwavering courage. First, they needed to confirm the lockbox's location. This task fell to Clara. She was the one with access to the house. Over the next few days, during her dusting and cleaning, she transformed into a spy in her own home. She searched with her eyes, her memory, her fingertips. She studied her uncle's routine, noting that he was obsessively protective of his study. She finally found it, not in a safe, but in a place of supreme arrogance. The small brass-inlaid rosewood box was hidden in a locked drawer of the very desk where he conducted his business, the symbol of his treachery nestled in the heart of his power. Second, they needed a way to get the lockbox out of the house and into the right hands. This was the most dangerous part. Jupiter, whose duties sometimes involved driving the wagon for supplies, was their only hope for transport. But he couldn't simply walk out with it. They needed a powerful, undeniable diversion. This is where Moses, with his deep knowledge of the plantation and its people, conceived the most perilous part of the plan. "Fire," the old man whispered, his eyes reflecting the flame of a single candle in his shack. "A fire in the north barn, the one where he stores the ginning equipment and the surplus fodder. It's far enough from the quarters not to endanger our people, but close enough to the main house to draw every man out, including the master and Shaw. It'll cause a panic. In the chaos, that will be your window." It was a terrifying idea. Arson was a capital offense, the one crime for which an enslaved person would be shown no mercy. But desperation had pushed them past the point of ordinary fear. The third and final piece of the plan was the destination. What good was the proof if they had no one to give it to? Samuel's mind went back to the early days after his father's death, to his desperate attempt to seek help. He remembered the families who had been their friends, the ones who had turned their backs. But there was one person his father had always spoken of with respect: Mrs. Genevieve Dubois. She was the wife of a neighboring planter, a quiet, pious woman who had been a close friend of his mother, Isabel. He remembered her kind eyes, the genuine sorrow on her face at the funeral. He knew her husband was a weak man, unlikely to help. But Genevieve, she was different. Their plantation bordered Vance Dominion to the west. It was a slim hope, but it was the only one they had. The night of Elias's planned departure for New Orleans was chosen as the night they would act. The timeline was set. The plan, the signal. Just after midnight, Clara would unlatch a specific window on the ground floor of the main house, one hidden from view by overgrown jasmine vines. This would be the signal that Elias was asleep and the house was quiet. The diversion. Upon seeing the signal, Moses would set the fire in the north barn. He insisted on doing this himself, claiming his age would make him less of a suspect if things went wrong. The entry. As soon as the alarm was raised and the house emptied, Samuel would slip inside through the unlatched window and go to the study. He would have to force the desk drawer. The handoff. With the lockbox in hand, Samuel would flee the house and run west, towards the old cypress tree that marked the boundary with the Dubois plantation. Jupiter, who would feign participation in fighting the fire, would create a secondary diversion near the stables to draw attention away from the western fence line. The delivery. Samuel would meet Clara, who would have slipped away from the chaos at the house, at the boundary tree. Together they would cross onto the Dubois property, find the house, and pray that Mrs. Dubois would listen. It was a chain of desperate hopes, where a single broken link would mean ruin, torture, and death for them all. In the days leading up to Elias's departure, a heavy, unspoken tension settled over them. They went about their duties, their faces masks of subservience, but their minds were on the night to come. They were no longer merely surviving. They were fighting back, armed with nothing but a desperate plan, and the courage born of having nothing left to lose. The night Elias was set to depart was heavy and breathless. The moon was a sliver, offering little light, and the air was so thick with humidity it felt like a wet blanket. A storm was brewing on the horizon, its distant, silent flashes of lightning illuminating the clouds like dying embers. Inside the main house, a tense energy crackled. Elias was in a foul mood, barking orders and complaining about the impending journey. Clara moved through the evening's preparations on trembling legs, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. Every simple act, pouring water, lighting a lamp, turning down her uncle's bed, felt monumental, the last ordinary moments before the world either changed or ended. She watched him from beneath her lashes, observing his every move. He drank more brandy than usual, his movements growing sluggish, his speech slightly slurred. Finally, well after 11, he retired to his room, slamming the door behind him. Clara waited, counting the seconds, her ears straining for any sound. The house slowly settled into silence, punctuated only by the chirping of crickets and the distant rumble of the approaching storm. She gave it another hour, an eternity of creeping dread, before she made her move. Slipping out of her small cot in the servants' attic, she moved barefoot through the darkened halls of the great house. She was a ghost, her steps lighter than a whisper on the polished floorboards. She knew every creak, every shadow. She reached the designated parlor on the ground floor, her hands shaking as she worked the latch on the tall window. It opened with a faint sigh, letting in the damp, fragrant air of the night garden. The signal was given. She retreated into the shadows of the hallway to wait, her gaze fixed on the northern sky. Miles away, hidden in the brush near the north barn, Moses saw the flicker of Clara's lamp as the window opened. He clutched the small bundle of oil-soaked rags and flint he had prepared. His heart was calm. He had lived a long, hard life. He had seen too much misery, too much injustice. If this was to be his final act, it would be a worthy one. He whispered a silent prayer, not for himself, but for the children. Then he moved swiftly towards the barn. Minutes later, a flicker of orange appeared against the barn's dark silhouette. It wavered for a moment, then greedily climbed the dry timber wall. A shout cut through the night. "Fire! Fire at the north barn!" The plantation erupted. Doors flew open. People spilled from the quarters, their voices a confused, panicked chorus. A bell began to clang frantically. In the main house, Elias burst from his room, bellowing for Shaw. Lights appeared in all the windows. Men, Elias and the overseer among them, ran from the house, their figures silhouetted against the rapidly growing blaze that was now painting the sky in hellish hues of orange and red. This was Samuel's cue. While all eyes were on the fire, he sprinted from his hiding place near the stables, his bare feet silent on the damp earth. He slipped through the jasmine vines and climbed through the open window into the parlor. The house was in chaos, the remaining house servants running towards the fire or fetching water buckets. He was unnoticed. He found the study. The door was unlocked. Using a small pry bar he had taken from the blacksmith shop, he forced the lock on the desk drawer. The wood splintered with a sound that seemed as loud as a gunshot in the tense silence. Inside, his fingers closed around the cool, smooth wood of the rosewood lockbox. It was smaller than he'd imagined, but its weight felt immense, the heft of their entire past and their only possible future. Clutching it to his chest, he retraced his steps. As he prepared to climb out the window, he heard footsteps in the hall. Prudence, the housekeeper, appeared in the doorway, her face illuminated by the fiery glow from outside. Her eyes widened, first at the splintered desk, then at the box in Samuel's hands. For a heart-stopping second, they stared at each other. Samuel saw a flicker of something in her eyes, not malice, but a deep, weary understanding. Then, without a word, she turned and walked away, her silence a profound, unspoken act of complicity. Samuel didn't wait. He scrambled out the window and ran, not towards the chaos of the fire, but away from it, towards the dark, silent west. The wind was picking up, carrying the smell of smoke and the promise of rain. The fire was the signal, the beacon of their desperate hope. And now, he ran from its light, plunging into the darkness where their fate awaited. As Samuel raced towards the western fence line, the lockbox held tight against his chest. The chaos behind him reached its peak. The fire in the north barn was now a roaring inferno, casting wild, dancing shadows across the entire plantation. The storm that had been threatening all evening finally broke. the first heavy drops of rain hissing as they hit the scorched ground. Jupiter, following the plan, created his own diversion. He accidentally released two of Elias's most spirited horses from the stable. Their panicked whinnies and the sight of them galloping wildly towards the main road drew several men, including two of Shaw's assistants, away from the main firefighting effort, clearing the path Samuel needed. But Mr. Shaw was not so easily distracted. The overseer possessed a predator's instinct for anything out of place. Amidst the shouting and the frenzy, he noticed a detail that bothered him. The fire had started too fast, too deliberately. His cold eyes scanned the crowds, searching not for heroes fighting the blaze, but for anyone who was not where they were supposed to be. His gaze fell upon the main house, where he saw a flicker of movement at a ground floor window. It was Prudence, turning away from the study. And in that same instant, he saw a shadow detach from the house and sprint west. "Boy!" Shaw's voice cut through the din like a whip crack. He ignored the fire, his sole focus now on the fleeing figure. He began to run, his long legs eating up the ground, his instincts screaming that this was no random runaway. This was part of something bigger. Meanwhile, Clara had used the pandemonium to slip away from the other house servants. She ran along a ditch, keeping low to the ground, her destination the ancient cypress tree on the Dubois property line. She arrived first, her breath coming in ragged gasps, the rain plastering her thin dress to her skin. She peered through the darkness, praying for a sign of Samuel. She saw him a moment later, a frantic silhouette against the fiery sky. But then she saw another figure, taller and faster, closing the distance between them. It was Shaw. "Samuel!" she screamed, her voice snatched away by the wind. Samuel heard her. He risked a glance over his shoulder and saw the overseer, his face a mask of fury in the flickering light. He knew he wouldn't make it. Shaw was too fast. In that split second, he made a decision. He could not be caught with the box. As he reached the massive gnarled roots of the cypress tree, he saw Moses stepping out from behind it. The old man had not fled after setting the fire. He had been waiting. "Go, child! Give it to your sister!" Moses commanded, his voice a low, urgent rumble. He held a thick, heavy branch like a club. Samuel didn't hesitate. He thrust the lockbox into Clara's hands. "Run, Clara! Don't stop for anything! Get it to the house! Go!" Shaw was upon them. He lunged for Samuel, but Moses stepped in his path. The old man swung the heavy branch with all the strength left in his wiry frame, catching the overseer across the shoulder. Shaw roared in pain and surprise, stumbling backward. "Get your brother out of here!" Moses yelled to Clara, turning to face the recovering overseer. Clara, tears and rain streaming down her face, grabbed Samuel's arm and pulled him across the dilapidated fence that marked the property line. They were off Vance land. They were free, if only by a few feet. They looked back. Shaw, recovering from the blow, raised the heavy butt of his whip and brought it down on the old man's head. Moses crumpled to the ground without a sound. The overseer stood over him for a moment, breathing heavily, then turned his malevolent gaze to the two children, who stood just out of his reach on the other side of the fence. He could not legally follow them, but the look in his eyes promised a reckoning. Samuel felt a cry of anguish tear from his throat. Moses, their mentor, their protector, had paid the ultimate price for their slim chance at freedom. He had sacrificed himself. There was no time to grieve. With Shaw watching them, Clara pulled her brother away from the fence line, the precious lockbox clutched in her hands like a prayer. They stumbled through the unfamiliar woods of the Dubois plantation, towards the faint, distant light of the main house, leaving behind the fire, the sounds of their own private war, and the body of the man who had bought them their escape. The price of this single step towards freedom was a debt written in blood. Soaked, mud-streaked, and shivering from a mixture of cold and terror, Samuel and Clara stumbled out of the woods and onto the manicured lawn of the Dubois plantation. The house before them was dark and silent, a stark contrast to the fiery chaos they had just fled. All its inhabitants were likely watching the blaze at the neighboring Vance dominion. Driven by a desperation that overrode all fear, Clara ran to the front door and beat upon it with her small fists, screaming for help. Samuel stood behind her, his gaze locked on the woods they had just emerged from, half expecting Shaw and his dogs to burst forth at any moment. Lights appeared in an upstairs window. A few minutes later, the heavy oak door creaked open. A man in a nightshirt, the portly and perpetually nervous Mr. Dubois, peered out, a pistol held shakily in his hand. His eyes widened in shock at the sight of the two bedraggled children. "Good heavens, what is the meaning of this?" he stammered. "Please, sir," Clara gasped, holding up the rosewood box. "We need to see Mrs. Dubois. It's a matter of life and death. It's about William Vance, our father." The mention of the name, combined with the raw terror in the children's faces, seemed to break through his confusion. Before he could respond, a woman's voice called from within. "Let them in, Henry. For mercy's sake, they're only children." Genevieve Dubois appeared behind her husband, her face pale but her eyes clear and compassionate. She recognized them immediately, a flicker of pained memory crossing her features. She pulled them inside, out of the rain, and into the grand foyer. In a torrent of frantic, overlapping sentences, they told her everything. They told her of their uncle's betrayal, the stolen inheritance, the forged documents, and their descent into the hell of Vance Dominion. Finally, with trembling hands, Samuel used the pry bar to break open the lockbox. Inside, resting on a bed of faded velvet, were the documents. Their mother's legitimate freedom papers from New Orleans. A certified copy of their parents' marriage certificate from St. Luke's Episcopal Church in Mobile. And most damning of all, their father's true last will and testament, handwritten and legally witnessed, leaving his entire estate to his wife Isabel, and in her death, to be held in trust for his children, Samuel and Clara. It named Elias as executor, but explicitly forbade him from inheriting any part of the shipping business or the mobile property. Genevieve Dubois read the papers, her face growing paler with each word. The story the children told was not just horrific, it was true. The proof was right there, in her hands. "This is an evil beyond comprehension," she whispered, looking from the papers to the children's faces, seeing for the first time not just runaways, but the orphaned and brutalized heirs of her dear departed friend. Her husband, however, was terrified. "Genevieve, we cannot get involved. Elias Vance is a powerful man. He will ruin us." Mrs. Dubois turned to him, her gentle demeanor replaced by a steely resolve that Samuel had never seen in a woman. "And we are to do nothing? Allow this monstrous crime to stand? William was your friend, Henry, and these are his children. I will not be a coward." She turned back to Samuel and Clara. "You cannot go back there, and you are not safe here. My husband is right about one thing. Elias's reach is long." She thought for a moment, her mind working quickly. "I have a cousin, a lawyer in Mobile. He is an honest man, a rarity, who despised Elias long before this. I will ride for the city at dawn myself. I will deliver these documents to him and to the circuit judge. I will not send them. I will place them in their hands." The future was a terrifying, uncertain fog. They were still legally considered property. Their uncle was still a powerful man who would soon discover what they had done. The reckoning was far from over. In many ways, it was just beginning. Elias would return from his aborted trip to New Orleans to find his barn in ashes, his property missing, and his darkest secrets on their way into the light. His rage would be biblical. But as they sat in the quiet, candle-lit parlor of the Dubois home, wrapped in warm blankets, a sliver of hope, sharper and brighter than any they had dared to entertain, pierced through the despair. They had lost their protector Moses, and their own survival was far from guaranteed. They were two children, scarred and battered, who had stood up to a monstrous injustice. They had not yet won their freedom, but they had reclaimed their names. And as the storm outside began to subside, giving way to the quiet promise of a new day, Samuel and Clara Vance held on to that single defiant truth. The night had been long and brutal, but for the first time they could truly believe in the coming of the dawn.